Long before Europeans arrived on these shores, hundreds of nations thrived across the Americas. They built civilizations, formed alliances, traded across thousands of miles, and
Our
preserved
languages
knowledge for
are
countless
tied
generations.
to the
But
land.
how did they
They carry
communicate
our
across such
history.
vast territories? How did tribes speaking completely different languages negotiate peace treaties? How did knowledge survive for thousands of years without written alphabets? This is the story of Native American communication, a story of ingenuity, adaptation, and survival that continues to this day. When we speak of Native American language, we're actually talking about hundreds of distinct languages as different from each other as English is from Arabic or French is from Japanese. Linguists have identified over 300 languages spoken north of Mexico alone, grouped into approximately 29 language families. The Algonquian languages stretched across the Northeast and Great Lakes. Iroquoian languages dominated the eastern woodlands. Siouan languages spread across the Great Plains. Athabascan languages ranged from Alaska to the southwest. Each language carried unique ways of understanding the world. Some languages had no word for goodbye because separations were seen as temporary. Others had dozens of words for snow, wind, or types of relationships that English lumps into single words. This linguistic diversity wasn't a barrier, it was a strength. Many Native Americans were multilingual by necessity. A Lakota trader might speak Lakota at home, learn Cheyenne for neighboring trade, and understand Crow for diplomatic relations. But what happened when tribes met who shared no common spoken language? How did a Comanche warrior communicate with a Cheyenne chief? How did trade networks spanning the continent function without a common tongue? The answer lies in one of the most sophisticated communication systems ever developed, the language of hands. Across the Great Plains, something remarkable emerged, a sign language so complex and nuanced that it allowed complete conversations between people who shared no spoken words. Plains Indian Sign Language, or PISL, developed over centuries as dozens of tribes, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, Kiowa, and many others, needed to communicate for trade, diplomacy, and survival. This wasn't simple gestures or pointing. This was a complete language with grammar, syntax, and thousands of signs representing everything from abstract concepts to specific animals, emotions, and actions. The sign for peace, hands crossed over the heart. The sign for trade, hands exchanging positions. The sign for friend, two fingers raised and crossed. The sign for enemy, fingers separated and pointed. When Lewis and Clark encountered tribes across the West, they marveled at this sign language. One expedition member wrote, "The dexterity and skill with which they communicate whole sentences by signs is truly astonishing." Consider what this achievement means. Without any formal education system, without writing, without centralized authority, diverse tribes across thousands of miles developed and maintained a standardized sign language that anyone could learn and use. Unlike many native traditions that were suppressed, sign language survived because it was documented by both native practitioners and outside observers. Today, efforts are underway to preserve and revitalize PISL, with elders teaching younger generations this ancient form of communication. But sign language required face-to-face contact. What about messages that needed to travel across vast distances? How did tribes warn each other of approaching danger? How did they coordinate gatherings across hundreds of miles? For that, they literally sent messages through the sky, messages in the sky. On a clear day across the plains or from mountain peaks, smoke could be seen for 50 miles or more. Contrary to Hollywood portrayals, smoke signals weren't a complex language transmitting detailed messages. Instead, they were a prearranged code system, simple but effective. A single column of smoke might mean attention or camp here. 2 columns could signal all is well. 3 columns often meant danger or a call for help. The timing, number of puffs, and pattern all carried meaning. Different tribes had different codes, known only to their people, a form of encryption thousands of years before modern cryptography. The process was ingenious. A fire would be built and allowed to produce steady smoke. Then a blanket or hide would be used to cover and uncover the smoke, creating distinct puffs visible for miles. The person sending the signal had to time each puff precisely, creating a rhythm that others would recognize. Apache scouts used mirrors to flash sunlight across distances. Some tribes used drums whose deep bass tones could travel for miles through forests. Others used whistles or horns made from shells or animal horns. These weren't casual communication tools. They were strategic military and survival systems that helped tribes coordinate movements, warn of threats, and maintain contact across territories larger than many European nations. Smoke signals saved lives. When enemies approached, when buffalo herds were spotted, when help was needed, these messages traveled faster than any horse could run. But what about permanent messages? How did tribes record history, mark territories, and communicate with future generations? The answer was literally written in stone,
The
stories in
ancient
stone.
voices of the
Across the
canyons speak
Americas,
to
on
us through
canyon
these
walls, cliff
walls,
faces,
a
and rock
canvas of
shelters,
time
native
preserved.
peoples left thousands of images, some painted, others carved into stone. Pictographs are images painted on rock using natural pigments ochre, charcoal, plant dyes. Petroglyphs are carved or pecked into stone surfaces. Some are thousands of years old, enduring through centuries of weather, their messages still visible today. These weren't random doodles. They were intentional communication, recording hunts, marking sacred sites, depicting important events, teaching spiritual lessons. Some images are clearly representational: bison, deer, human figures engaged in hunting or ceremony. Others are geometric patterns or abstract symbols whose meanings are debated to this day. Many sites show layers of images added over centuries, creating visual histories where each generation added their story to those who came before. Unlike European alphabetic writing, which represents sounds, these images represented ideas and stories. The same image might convey different information depending on who was reading it and what context they understood. A circle might represent the sun, the cycle of seasons, unity, or wholeness. A spiral could mean journey, water, or the passage of time. The meaning wasn't fixed, it was contextual, requiring cultural knowledge to fully understand. Plains tribes developed winter counts, pictographic calendars painted on buffalo hides. Each year was represented by a single image depicting the most significant event of that year. The year many stars fell, the Leonid meteor shower of 1833. The year the buffalo disappeared. The year of the Great Flood. The year a chief died. The year smallpox came. These winter counts preserved history across generations. Some span over 200 years of continuous recording, an unbroken chain of memory. When elders passed away, younger keepers would learn to read the count, memorizing the story each image represented. This combination of visual record and oral tradition created a robust system. The hide could be damaged or lost, but the knowledge lived in people. The keeper could die, but the hide remained as a memory trigger for others who knew the stories. But perhaps the most sophisticated visual communication system developed in the Northeast, where wampum became more than decoration. It became a form of diplomacy and historical record. Beads that spoke.
The
To
wampum belt
European
is more than
colonists,
just an
wampum looked
artifact,
like decorative
woven
beadwork.
from
But to
thousands
the
of hand-drilled
Haudenosaunee, the
shell
Iroquois
beads.
Confederacy, and other northeastern tribes, wampum belts were diplomatic documents, historical records, and sacred agreements. Wampum beads were made from shells, white from whelk shells, purple from quahog clam shells. Creating these beads was labor-intensive. The shells had to be collected, cut into small pieces, drilled with primitive tools, shaped and polished. A single belt might contain thousands of beads, representing weeks or months of work. These beads were woven into belts with specific patterns, each pattern carrying meaning. The colors, arrangements, and designs created a visual language that trained interpreters could read. The two-row wampum, or gaswenta, represents one of the most important diplomatic agreements in North American history. Two parallel purple rows on a white background. The two purple rows represent two vessels, a canoe and a ship traveling down the river of life together. Neither tries to steer the other's vessel. The white background represents peace, friendship, and respect. This belt recorded the first treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Dutch colonists in 1613. It established principles of mutual respect and non-interference that the Haudenosaunee still reference today, over 400 years later. Different patterns recorded different agreements. The Hiawatha Belt symbolized the unification of the five nations into the Iroquois Confederacy. Condolence belts marked the death of important leaders. Treaty belts documented agreements with other nations. But here's what made wampum truly remarkable as a communication system. The belts weren't simply read like a book. They were memory triggers for trained wampum keepers who had memorized the full agreements and stories. When disputes arose, wampum keepers would read the belt aloud in council, reciting the complete agreement from memory while holding the belt. The belt validated their authority and accuracy. It was proof that they spoke truth, that they remembered correctly. This meant wampum was both a physical record and an oral tradition working together, combining the permanence of physical objects with the detailed nuance of spoken agreements. The system was so effective that treaty negotiations could take place over multiple days or even weeks, with every word debated, agreed upon, and then encoded into wampum patterns. When both sides accepted the final agreement, the belt became the permanent record, but a record that lived as much in the keeper's memory as in the beads themselves. The living library. In societies without alphabetic writing, how do you preserve accurate information across generations? How do you maintain legal codes, historical records, spiritual teachings, and practical knowledge for hundreds or thousands of years? The answer: oral tradition, but not the kind of casual storytelling we might
The
imagine.
fire
This was
remembers the old
systematic,
stories.
disciplined, and remarkably accurate.
When the flames
Native
did
American
dance
oral
high
traditions
like
used
this.
multiple techniques to ensure accuracy across generations. First, repetition and memorization.
The
Stories were
fire
repeated
remembers the
exactly,
old
word for word,
stories.
from master to student.
When the
Important
flames did
narratives
dance
weren't
high
paraphrased or
like this.
summarized, they were performed verbatim, with specific phrases, rhythms, and even pauses preserved. Second, rhythmic patterns. Many teachings were put to rhythm or song, making them easier to remember accurately. The human brain naturally recalls rhythmic information better than prose. Chants, songs, and patterned speech became vessels for knowledge. Third, public verification. Stories were told in community settings where elders would correct any mistakes. If a storyteller changed even a small detail, someone who knew the correct version would speak up. This peer review system maintained accuracy. Fourth, multiple keepers. Important knowledge was held by several people, providing redundancy. If one keeper died unexpectedly, others could continue the tradition. Knowledge was never entrusted to just one person. Fifth, ceremonial reinforcement. Annual ceremonies retold creation stories, historical events, and tribal laws. This regular repetition, sometimes occurring at the same time each year for centuries, created deep memory pathways. When anthropologists began recording these oral traditions in the 19th and 20th centuries, they were stunned by their accuracy. Stories told in the 1900s match stories recorded by early European observers in the 1600s, 300 years of oral transmission with minimal change.
The
Some
fire
oral
remembers
traditions
the old
described
stories.
geological events that scientists
When the
later
flames did
confirmed.
dance high
Stories of
like
volcanic
this.
eruptions, earthquakes, and floods were dismissed as mythology until geological evidence proved them accurate accounts of events thousands of years old. Native American oral traditions in the Pacific Northwest describe a massive earthquake and tsunami. Scientists initially dismissed these as legends. Then geological evidence confirmed a magnitude 9 earthquake struck the region on January 26, 1700, exactly as the stories described. The oral traditions had preserved accurate information for 300 years. Astronomical knowledge was preserved in star stories. Navigation techniques were embedded in landscape descriptions. Medical knowledge was passed through healing songs and plant stories. Legal codes lived in recitations of proper behavior and consequences. Each form of knowledge had its appropriate vessel. Sacred stories were told only at certain times of year by designated storytellers. Practical knowledge, how to find water, which plants were edible, how to track animals, was shared more freely. Family histories were the responsibility of family elders. The genius of oral tradition wasn't just memorization. It was understanding that different types of information required different preservation methods. And it was recognizing that knowledge isn't separate from relationship. Teaching happened in context, with elders modeling not just what to remember, but why it mattered and how to carry it forward. Today, many tribes are using modern technology to support oral traditions, recording elders, creating digital archives, developing language apps. But the core principle remains. Knowledge lives in people, not just in recordings or books, because oral tradition isn't just about memorizing words. It's about understanding context, relationship, and responsibility to both past and future generations. Speaking
The
without
traditional
words.
feathered headdress is a
Communication
profound
isn't just
statement of
words and
identity,
symbols. It's
history,
also
and
how we
honor,
present ourselves to the
meticulously
world.
crafted.
Native Americans developed sophisticated visual languages of identity through clothing, body paint, hairstyles, and adornment. Among Plains tribes, feather arrangements in headdresses communicated military achievements and social status. Each feather might represent a specific act of bravery or leadership. A warrior's headdress was a visual resume. Anyone who knew the code could read his accomplishments at a glance. Not just anyone could wear a full headdress. These had to be earned through demonstrated courage, leadership, and service to the community. Wearing unearned feathers was considered deeply shameful, comparable to wearing military medals you hadn't earned. Face paint wasn't random decoration. Specific colors and patterns indicated a warrior's intentions, spiritual state, or tribal affiliation. Red might symbolize war or blood. Black could represent victory or mourning. White often meant peace or spiritual purity. Yellow connected to the sun or sacred knowledge. Before a battle, warriors would paint their faces in patterns that communicated their state of mind. Some patterns were personal designs received in visions or dreams. Others were shared by warrior societies. The paint itself was part of spiritual preparation, transforming the wearer from everyday person to warrior. Clothing communicated tribal identity at a glance. The cut of a moccasin, the style of a dress, the pattern of beadwork, all announced where someone came from and often their role in their community. An experienced observer could identify someone's tribe, clan, and social status just by looking at their clothing. This wasn't superficial, it was practical. In gatherings of multiple tribes, visual identification prevented confusion and showed respect by acknowledging someone's identity and background. Some tribes used permanent body modification. Tattoos marked achievements, spiritual experiences, or clan membership. Among some peoples, specific tattoos were earned, not chosen visual resumes of a person's life accomplishments. Hairstyles also communicated. Some tribes shaved portions of their heads in distinctive patterns. Others grew their hair long as a spiritual practice. Certain styles marked different life stages: childhood, coming of age, marriage, elderhood. Today, these visual languages continue. At powwows and ceremonies, regalia still communicates identity, achievement, and cultural connection. The jingle dress, the fancy shawl, the grass dance outfit, each has its own history and meaning. But Native people also navigate multiple worlds, code switching between traditional and contemporary presentation as circumstances require. The ability to communicate identity, to declare who you are and where you come from, remains as important now as it was centuries ago. The human network. Before telegraph, before telephone, before internet, there were runners. Many native nations maintained networks of trained messengers who could cover vast distances carrying verbal messages with extraordinary accuracy. The Iroquois Confederacy employed official messengers called runners who traveled between the nations of the Confederacy, sometimes covering hundreds of miles through wilderness, carrying complex diplomatic messages that had to be delivered word for word. These weren't casual joggers. They were trained professionals, often chosen young and developed over years of preparation. They needed exceptional memory to carry complex verbal messages without error. A diplomatic message might take an hour to recite fully. The runner had to memorize every word, every nuance, every emphasis. Making a mistake could cause diplomatic incidents or even wars. They needed physical endurance to travel 50 or more miles per day through wilderness. These weren't maintained roads, they were trails through forests, over mountains, across rivers. Runners traveled in all weather, all seasons. They needed diplomatic skills to represent their nations. A runner wasn't just delivering words, they were ambassadors, and their conduct reflected on their entire people. Their journeys followed established trail networks, paths worn deep by generations of use. Some of these ancient trails later became colonial roads, then modern highways. Interstate 80 follows portions of the Great Indian Warpath. The Natchez Trace was a native trade route for thousands of years before it became a modern parkway. Runners often carried physical tokens, wampum strings, marked sticks, or other objects that authenticated their messages. The object proved they spoke with authority, that they truly represented the leader or council that sent them. In some nations, relay systems existed. A message might be carried by one runner for a day's journey, then passed to a fresh runner who continued forward. This allowed messages to travel faster than any single person could sustain. The Inca of South America had the most elaborate runner system ever developed in the Americas. Their Chasqui runners maintained a network spanning thousands of miles of mountain roads, with relay stations every few miles. Messages could travel from Quito to Cusco over 1,000 miles in just 5 days, faster than any communication system in Europe at the time. Today, many tribes honor this tradition with long-distance runs and relay races, connecting contemporary native youth with the endurance and dedication of ancestral messengers. These runs aren't just athletic events, they're cultural practices, reminding participants that they're part of a chain of communication reaching back centuries. The power of council. How do you make
When
decisions
this
when your
stick is
nation
presented,
consists of thousands of people spread
listen,
across
and to
vast
listen with
territories?
patience.
How do you ensure everyone's voice is heard? How do you build consensus rather than simply having the powerful impose their will? Native American governance often relied on consensus building rather than simple majority rule. This required sophisticated communication practices and remarkable patience. Many tribes used talking sticks, talking feathers, or other objects to manage council discussions. Only the person holding the object could speak. Everyone else had to listen. This simple tool enforced respect, prevented interruptions, and ensured even quiet voices were heard. When you knew you'd have uninterrupted time to speak, you could express complex thoughts without rushing. You didn't have to shout to be heard or fight for attention. The talking stick was passed around the circle, sometimes multiple times, until every person who wished to speak had done so. Only then would discussion move toward decision. Councils often sat in circles, no head position, everyone equal and facing everyone else. This physical arrangement communicated democratic principles before anyone spoke. The chief or leader sat in the circle with everyone else, not elevated above the group. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy developed one of the world's most sophisticated democratic systems. Their Great Law of Peace included provisions for separation of powers, checks and balances, women's political authority, impeachment procedures, freedom of speech in council, and unanimous consent for major decisions. Women held significant power in Haudenosaunee governance. Clan mothers selected the chiefs and could remove them if they failed to serve the people. Women's councils made decisions about internal matters, while men's councils handled external relations and war. Both had to agree for major decisions to be implemented. When Benjamin Franklin and other colonial leaders designed American democracy, they studied and borrowed from Haudenosaunee governance. The ideas of federalism, separation of powers, and democratic councils influenced the U.S. Constitution. But where American democracy often prioritizes efficiency and majority rule, traditional native governance emphasized patience, consensus, and ensuring minority voices weren't trampled. A decision might take days or weeks of discussion, but when reached, everyone had been heard and most agreed. The Haudenosaunee had a saying, "In our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations." That long-term thinking required communication systems that could preserve and transmit complex ideas across time. Decisions made today would affect people not yet born. Council members had to think
When
beyond
this stick
immediate
is
needs to
presented,
long-term consequences.
listen,
This
and to
principle,
listen with
considering the 7th generation, represents a fundamentally different approach to decision-making than most modern systems employ. It requires that every policy, every choice, every action be evaluated not just for its immediate effects, but for how it will shape the world a century and a half into the future. A gift of literacy. In 1821, something unprecedented happened in Native American history. A Cherokee man named Sequoyah accomplished what no individual had ever done before. He single-handedly created a complete writing system for his language. Sequoyah was not a linguist. He couldn't read or write English. He had no formal education in language structure or phonetics, but he understood that the talking leaves, written documents, gave Europeans a powerful advantage. So he spent 12 years developing a writing system for Cherokee. His family thought he was wasting his time. Some accused him of witchcraft. He burned his first attempt after his wife, fearing it was dangerous magic, destroyed his work. But he persisted, driven by the conviction that Cherokee people needed their own writing system. Rather than an alphabet where each symbol represents a sound, Sequoyah created a syllabary where each symbol represents a complete syllable. The Cherokee syllabary has 85 characters representing all the syllables in the Cherokee language. He demonstrated his system to Cherokee leaders by having his young daughter, who he had taught to read and write, exchange written messages with him while out of earshot. When the leaders saw that complex information could be transmitted through these symbols, they immediately recognized its value. Within just a few years, the Cherokee Nation achieved nearly universal literacy in their own language. Sequoyah's syllabary was so intuitive that Cherokee speakers could learn it in just days or weeks. Soon, Cherokee people who had never been to school were reading and writing. They published newspapers, the Cherokee Phoenix being the first, launched in 1828. They translated the Bible and other religious texts. They wrote constitutions and legal codes, all in Cherokee. The Cherokee Nation became one of the most literate societies in the world. with literacy rates exceeding those of surrounding white populations. This literacy gave the Cherokee powerful tools for political organization and resistance. When the U.S. government attempted to force their removal in the 1830s, the Cherokee used written petitions, legal briefs, and newspaper articles to argue their case. Though they ultimately lost and were forced on the Trail of Tears, their written advocacy demonstrated the power of literacy as a tool for indigenous rights. Sequoiah's achievement inspired other native peoples. Missionaries adapted his idea to create syllabics for Cree, Inuktitut, and other Canadian indigenous languages. These syllabic systems are still in use today, appearing on stop signs, government documents, and digital devices across northern Canada. Today, the Cherokee syllabary remains in active use. Cherokee Nation has language immersion schools where children learn to read and write in syllabary before learning English. It's a living writing system, adapting to modern technology while maintaining its traditional form. You can type in Cherokee syllabary on smartphones and computers. Digital fonts preserve the unique characters for the internet age. Sequoyah proved that writing systems aren't gifts from outside civilizations or marks of cultural superiority. They can emerge from within, created by people who understand their own language's needs. His accomplishment stands as one of the great intellectual achievements in human history, the independent invention of writing by a single individual, designed specifically for his people's linguistic needs. Silence and survival. The history of Native American communication isn't just about ingenious systems and remarkable preservation. It's also about deliberate destruction and even more remarkable survival. Beginning in the late 1800s, the U.S. and Canadian governments implemented policies designed to kill the Indian, save the man, a phrase from Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Native children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools where speaking their languages was forbidden. Punishments for speaking native languages included beating, mouthwashing with soap, solitary confinement, and public humiliation. Children's hair was cut, removing a sacred aspect of identity for many tribes. Their clothes were taken and replaced with uniforms. Their names were changed to English names. Everything about their identity was attacked. The goal was cultural genocide, to break the communication systems that transmitted native identity, knowledge, and culture. If children couldn't speak their languages, they couldn't participate in ceremonies. They couldn't learn from elders. They couldn't maintain their cultures. One survivor of these schools remembered, "I was beaten for speaking the only language I knew. I went to that school fluent in my language and returned unable to speak to my grandmother." By the mid-20th century, the results were devastating. Of the 300-plus languages spoken in North America before contact, many had disappeared entirely. Many more had only a handful of elderly speakers remaining. Entire branches of linguistic families went extinct, taking with them unique ways of understanding the world. But native peoples resisted. Even at the risk of punishment, some parents secretly taught children their languages. Some elders preserved knowledge by recording it or teaching trusted students. Some communities maintained language use in hidden spaces where authorities couldn't reach. And ironically, the same languages the government tried to destroy became crucial to Allied victory in World War II. Navajo code talkers used their language to create an unbreakable military code. The U.S. military recruited Navajo speakers to develop a code based on their language. Japanese code breakers, who had successfully broken every other Allied code, were completely baffled. They couldn't crack it because they had no reference point. Navajo was unlike any language they knew, and there were no Navajo speakers in Japan to consult. Code talkers transmitted crucial battlefield communications throughout the Pacific Theater. They could encode, transmit, and decode messages in minutes, while machines took hours. Military leaders credited them with saving countless American lives and contributing significantly to victory. The very incomprehensibility that boarding schools tried to eliminate became America's secret weapon. The languages deemed savage and primitive proved more sophisticated than any code machines could create. After the war, code talkers returned home to reservations where their languages were still forbidden in schools, where they still faced discrimination, where their contributions remained classified secrets for decades. They had proven the value of their languages on the world stage, yet at home, those same languages were still under attack. In recent decades, a language revitalization movement has emerged across Native America. Tribes are fighting to reclaim what was nearly stolen from them. Language immersion schools now operate across Indian country, where children learn entirely in native languages for their first years of education. Master-apprentice programs pair fluent elders with young learners for intensive one-on-one language transmission. Digital archives are recording thousands of hours of elder speech before the last fluent speakers pass away. Language apps and online courses are making languages accessible to tribal members who live far from their homelands. Youth language camps combine cultural activities with intensive language learning. Universities offer courses in native languages, some taught by native speakers for the first time. Some languages once thought dead are being revived. Miamia, the Miami tribal language, had no fluent speakers in the 1990s. Linguists worked with historical documents and the last semi-speakers to reconstruct the language. Today, children are growing up speaking Miamia as a first language, a language literally brought back from extinction. Wampanoag, the language of the people who met the Pilgrims, was silent for over a century. Jessie Little Doe Baird had a dream where ancestors spoke to her in Wampanoag, language she didn't know. She began studying historical documents and reconstructed the language. Now it has new speakers and a teaching program. Her daughter is the first person to have Wampanoag as a first language in over 100 years. These revivals require tremendous effort. Languages aren't just vocabulary lists, they're complete systems of grammar, pronunciation, cultural context, and ways of thinking. Reviving a language means rebuilding all of that from fragments. But tribal communities are doing it because language carries more than just communication. It carries identity, worldview, connection to ancestors, and ways of understanding that exist in no other language. Native American communication didn't stop evolving in the past. It continues to adapt and thrive today, combining ancient practices with cutting-edge technology. Native peoples are using modern technology to preserve and share traditional communication in ways previous generations could never imagine. Social media platforms host native language lessons and cultural teachings. Elders record videos teaching traditional stories, songs, and practices. These videos are watched by tribal members around the world, maintaining connections that geography once made difficult. YouTube channels teach traditional stories to new generations in both native languages and English. Podcasts discuss native issues, conduct interviews in native languages, and create spaces for Indigenous voices. Some podcasts are entirely in native languages, creating immersive listening experiences for learners. Video games are incorporating native languages and storytelling traditions. Never Alone, created in partnership with the Inupiat people of Alaska, teaches traditional stories while players navigate challenges. The game features elders speaking Inupiaq, introducing the language to players worldwide. Virtual reality is being used to preserve sacred sites and ceremonies digitally. As climate change and development threaten physical sites, VR creates permanent records. Some tribes are also using VR to create immersive language learning experiences. Young native people are reclaiming their identities and languages through digital platforms, creating content that's simultaneously traditional and cutting-edge. Native TikTok creators teach language phrases, share cultural practices, and challenge stereotypes through short videos reaching millions. Instagram accounts focused on language and culture share daily vocabulary, correct misconceptions, and build community among native youth who may have grown up disconnected from their heritage. These platforms create spaces where being native and speaking native languages is celebrated, not hidden. Tribal radio stations broadcast in native languages across reservations. These stations provide news, music, cultural programming, and emergency information in languages that many elders still prefer. Some stations stream online, reaching tribal members worldwide. Native-run media organizations report news from native perspectives. Indian Country Today, Native News Online, and others provide journalism about native issues by native journalists. Film and television increasingly feature native writers, directors, and actors telling their own stories. Shows like Reservation Dogs present authentic native experiences created by native people. Universities now offer courses in Native American studies taught by native scholars. Tribal colleges educate students in both Western academic traditions and tribal knowledge systems, creating graduates who can navigate both worlds. Some tribes have achieved legal recognition for their languages in official proceedings. In Montana, the Crow and Northern Cheyenne languages can be used in court proceedings. In Alaska, 20 native languages have official status alongside English. These legal recognitions matter. They affirm that native languages have equal validity and value, and traditional communication continues in traditional spaces. Powwows gather thousands where drum songs, dances, and oral traditions are shared. These gatherings strengthen intertribal connections and pass traditions to younger generations. Ceremonies continue in tribal languages. Even among tribes where language loss has been severe, ceremonial language is often preserved because it's considered essential to proper practice. Elders still teach through stories, using the same narrative techniques their ancestors employed for thousands of years. The forms may evolve, but the core principles remain. Communication is relationship. Language carries identity. Stories preserve knowledge. And every generation has the responsibility to receive what the past offers and pass it to the future. Today's native youth are taking up that responsibility in new ways. They're learning languages that their parents couldn't teach them because boarding schools stole those languages from their grandparents. They're recording elders while there's still time. They're creating new words for modern concepts, showing that native languages are living, growing systems, not museum artifacts. They're proving that native communication isn't just history, it's present and future. The voices haven't been silenced. The languages haven't died. The stories continue. For thousands of years, Native Americans developed sophisticated systems of communication perfectly adapted to their needs, environments, and values. They created sign languages that crossed linguistic barriers, allowing tribes with completely different languages to negotiate, trade, and build alliances. They sent messages through smoke and mirrors across vast distances, creating early warning systems that protected communities. They recorded history in beads and paint and stone, creating permanent records that survived centuries. They preserved knowledge in stories and songs passed generation to generation with remarkable accuracy, maintaining legal codes, historical records, and practical knowledge without writing. They built diplomatic protocols based on consensus and long-term thinking that influenced modern democracy. They developed writing systems when they needed them, proving that literacy emerges from within cultures when circumstances require it. They resisted cultural genocide and maintained their languages and traditions despite systematic attempts to destroy them. Today, Native peoples continue to communicate in traditional languages and English, through ancient methods and modern technology, preserving the past while creating the future. Every time an elder teaches a child a word in their language, communication across time happens. Every time a story is told, history stays alive. Every time a young person learns traditional skills, knowledge survives. Every podcast in a native language, every TikTok teaching a phrase, every immersion school graduate, every ceremony conducted in traditional language. These are victories in an ongoing struggle to maintain Indigenous voices. Native American communication isn't just history in museums and textbooks. It's a living, evolving practice that adapts while maintaining continuity with the past. The smoke signals may have given way to cell phones. The runners may have been replaced by email. But the fundamental purpose remains unchanged: to maintain connection, to preserve identity, to pass knowledge forward, to ensure that communities survive and thrive. The voices haven't been silenced. The languages are being reclaimed. The stories continue being told. And as long as Native peoples exist, their communication will continue: speaking, signing, painting, beating, drumming, singing, posting, streaming, broadcasting, ensuring that the voices across time never fade into silence. This is not a story of a dead past. This is a story of resilience, adaptation, and determination. This is a story that continues today and will continue tomorrow, carried forward by new generations who honor the past while building the future. The conversation that began thousands of years ago continues, and the voices across time are growing louder.
Listen, and to listen with patience.